Last week on Rosh Hashanah, I spent some time preparing before Unatana Tokef, sharing with you meditation, my own thoughts, my own interpretation of that very challenging prayer, the prayer that imagines God and a book of life, knowing who's to live and who's to die, who by fire, who by water, who by storm, who by hunger, who by famine, who by thirst. And I offered my own interpretation, largely rejecting that concept, that theology. I don't believe in an omnipotent, omniscient God who literally sits before a book of life and, like Santa Claus, lists who's been naughty and nice, determining each year who shall live and who shall die, who by fire or water, who by hunger or thirst. And I think I have taught my own interpretation over the years. If I wanted to try to define what that interpretation might be, it is a humanistic religious Judaism, a view of the divine that is not the omnipotent, omniscient God sitting on a throne in heaven. I have always rejected that concept of the God of Unatana Tokef. But this year, it became clear to me what some of the origins of my own personal philosophy and theology emanate from. On May 16th of this year, Rabbi Richard Rubenstein died at the age of 97. In certain ways, I considered Rabbi Rubenstein to be my childhood rabbi. I grew up in a conservative congregation in Pittsburgh, and Rabbi Rubenstein was the rabbi of Hillel for the University of Pittsburgh and for Carnegie Mellon. And at the time of High Holy Days, when the sanctuary at my congregation was filled to capacity, there was an overflow service that would take place either in the auditorium or in the social hall, and Rabbi Rubenstein was the overflow rabbi. Now, I always went to whatever service at which he was speaking. Rubenstein was fascinating, inspiring, dynamic, exacerbating, polarizing, provocative, but I can still remember some of his sermons and certainly his delivery. He was charismatic and brilliant. But he was most famous for a book he wrote in 1966 called After Auschwitz. And he became part of a group of theologians, largely Protestants, of the Death of God school. He was widely read and critiqued. He had achieved a certain degree of fame. Indeed, in 1967, he was subject to a Playboy interview. Now, this was wonderful for a 16-year-old boy because I had an excuse for saying that I was just reading the magazine for its articles. But Rubenstein was far too easily dismissed by this death of God concept. He was no atheist or a non-believer. He believed in the death of the traditional understanding of God. He believed in the death of the God of the suburban Sunday school. He believed that the traditional understanding of a God who could intervene in history and in human affairs no longer made sense after the Holocaust. He rejected a supernatural God. He saw it as a pediatric version of God. He argued that the God of history, who was omnipotent or omniscient, could no longer be credible in a post-Holocaust world. This is what he wrote. When I say we live in the time of the death of God, I mean that the thread uniting God and humanity, heaven and earth, has been broken. After Auschwitz, the belief in a redeeming God who is active in history and who will redeem humanity from all evil is simply no longer possible. If there is a God who's able to act, who's able to redeem, who's able to save, but who chooses not to do so, one can no longer accept a God who would do that and who then would be worthy of worshiping. After Auschwitz, it was impossible to believe in a God who had the power to save, who had the power to rescue humanity from the evil of the Nazi death camps, or even from illness, or floods, or hunger, or thirst, but who chooses not to do so. That is the God who was dead to Rubinstein. Rubinstein was a theological radical, even though he was an observant Jew for the rest of his life, and he was deeply politically conservative. But I was inspired by his rejection of the traditional concept of God. The idea of a God who does not act in history is not a late 20th century concept, however, in Judaism. I soon learned through my studies at Hebrew Union College, at the Hartman Institute, in studying Talmud, that this is a very old concept of a God who is limited in power. In the Talmud, one of the best-known stories comes from the tractate Bava Metzia 59 AB. It's a story of the oven of Achanai. Some of you may know it. It is a story about rabbis getting together and creating a law, halakha. What's kosher, what's not kosher, what's okay to be used, what's not okay. And this oven of Achanai was a simple stove oven made of tile with grouting in between. And as you know, when you have tile and the grouting, it can get dirty. And so the question that the rabbis were posing to themselves is, in this oven, if it gets unkosher, is it possible to keep using it if you can clean it? Is it possible to kosher the oven? Now, this is a pretty arcane dispute. This is not world-shattering. This is not the most important thing in the world. This is pots and pans, right? This is like checking on utensils. And yet the rabbis make a decision. Their decision is that the oven of Achanai is not kosher. But one rabbi, Eliezer, says, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. It can be made kosher. They said, well, we decided you're wrong. The halakha, the law, is according to our joint decision. Eliezer won't accept it. So Eliezer said, I'm right. And to prove I'm right, you see that carob tree outside? It's going to uproot itself and fly into the air. Sure enough, the carob tree uproots itself, flies up into the air, and we would call that either magic or a miracle. And the rabbis answer Eliezer and say, we don't make the law according to carob trees. So Eliezer says, but I'm right. And to prove it, the stream of water, the channel of water is going to reverse itself. This is before the Army Corps of Engineers reversed the Chicago River. That would be a miracle too. And the rabbis say, we don't make halachic decisions based on channels of water. Eliezer is very frustrated. He says, I'm right, and to prove it, the walls of this study hall are going to collapse on all of us. Rabbi Joshua gets up and says, stay out of it. We're making a decision according to a rabbinic court. Well, when Rabbi Joshua says, stay out of it, who is he talking to? He's talking to God. Eliezer then says, no, I'm still right. There's going to be a but call, a voice from heaven is going to come out and say that I'm right. Now remember last week, the voice from heaven that told Abraham not to sacrifice his son? Well, the voice of heaven comes out again and says, the halacha is always according to Eliezer. And Joshua quotes tomorrow's Torah portion from Deuteronomy, from Nitzavim. It says, Lo b'shamayim hi. It's not in heaven. They silence God. They say what goes on in our everyday life is really no concern of yours. We're judges. We're creating law. We're not waiting for revelation. That's not our goal. And so Joshua put God in God's place. And we're taught that God cannot intervene in everyday human affairs. Long before Richard Rubinstein. And in a larger sense, that is the whole rabbinic view of the world. It moves from a theocentric world, a God-centric world, to an anthrocentric world, a human-centric world. Rabbinic Judaism begins with the question of, what time is it? What time do we have to do things? Well, if you go to Genesis, we know when the day begins and when the day ends. The day begins at sunrise. It ends at sunset. That's Genesis. But that's not Rabbinic Judaism. That's not the Mishnah. When is the day begin? When you wake up. Some of us wake up at sunrise, but not all of us. And when does the day end? The day end when you drag yourself in from a late night party. And it may be 2 or 3 in the morning, but it's the previous day. Humans determine time according to the rabbis. It's not based on divine revelation or divine intervention. That is, I use the word carefully, modern Judaism, modern being 2,000 years old. God is not an active agent or presence in the world as we know it, and fires and floods, hurricanes and famine and droughts are not an act of God. We are responsible for the world in which we live. And so that's a core of what I believe. I've given you many hints over the years, I think. There are a few other beliefs that I've shared with you that I thought I would just summarize in this last Kol Nidre sermon of my rabbinate here. A few years ago, I talked about the heresy of narcissism. This core teaching of the Bible, particularly of the book of Exodus, is God saying, I'm God, you're not. That we are not God, that idol worship is making ourselves into the divine. Last week I talked about the God of relationship, of Buber's I and thou. I believe in the God of the metaphor, at least, of creation of Adam, of human, of Adam, from Adamah, from earth, earthling from earth, human from humus, and then the breath of the divine being breathed into that earth stuff, and then That is what animates us, and that is how we become containers of the divine. I believe in what's called predicate theology. Not who is God or what is God, but when is God. God is not good or merciful or loving. Goodness is godly. Mercy and love are godly. I believe in the unseen God of wind and love. The breath of God coming out of the burning bush, saying that God's proper name was Yud, He, Vav, He, but not pronounced, more like That's the theology that I understand. And that is the theology for me that connects me to a larger, more lasting, more eternal existence. All of that is the breath of the divine. But Rubinstein's favorite metaphor was the ocean. Rubinstein said, God is the ocean, and we are the waves. In some sense, each wave has its moment in which it is indistinguishable as a somewhat separate entity. But nevertheless, no wave is entirely distinct from the ocean. The waves are surface manifestations of the ocean, even as our knowledge of the ocean is largely dependent on the way it manifests itself in the waves. That's Rubinstein's theology. You might recognize it as something that it was in the very popular book by Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Morrie. It's repeated there in the narrative. As Morrie is dying, he tells the story of the wave looking out at the shore and realizing that it is going to die when it hits the shore. And then the waves behind that wave say, don't be silly, you're not a wave, you're the ocean. And that's who we are. We make the very most of our brief existence as separate individual waves. But we also know ultimately that we are part of a much greater whole, the ocean. It is not an act of death, but one of becoming one with God. And that is the oneness which we repeat every time we get together and pray with the Shema. And that is how I see my own humanity and my connection with the divine and the sacred. It is the source of feeling blessed. To be a part of something that is much larger than oneself, that lasts longer than each of our own individual lives, that finds the sacred in each encounter with each other, and that celebrates life as the greatest gift we receive from the divine. And let us live this next year aware of that gift and grateful for that blessing. Shana Tova.